Well, thank you, Alex Rogers, for putting this together. And I think, speak for all of us, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Luke Richner. Regulatory landscape and navigating in it is kind of something I slid into over the last couple of years. I'll share a bit more about that in a second. I'd like to give my esteemed colleagues here a chance to introduce themselves before we jump into the panel and share a bit of our insights, what has happened in the world so far and where this is hopefully going, and see if we can actually make sense of this industry after the next 40 minutes. Anthony.
First and foremost, honor to be here. Thanks a lot to all the organizers. I'm Anthony Charig. I'm from Canada Intelligence. I'm the head legal analyst there. We provide market and legal analysis and data for the cannabis sector. I was a lawyer in the US for several years before moving to Barcelona, Spain. Quite an upgrade in my opinion. Very happy there. I've been there about 7 years.
I'm Dr. Shauna Variki. I'm a head of research and toxicology at True Terpenes. I got my PhD studying chemistry of vaping, and then I switched over to True Terpenes and created their toxicology program. With all that research, I've been able to educate lawmakers and regulators and help actually write the language that goes into laws. And then also, I've been able to support manufacturers if it does come to legal proceedings.
Hi everyone, Deepak Anand. I'm the head of consulting at Gateway Proven Strategies. Been around the space quite a few years, just over 11 years. Worked very closely with a number of governments on cannabis policy and regulations, starting in North America and then kind of moving across the world on a global basis. Done a lot of work in Europe as well, both in the medical cannabis and also CBD sector. So happy to be here today.
My name is Lucas McCann. I'm CSO and co-founder of a regulatory and scientific cannabis consulting company called CanDelta. I have a background in medicinal organic chemistry, medicinal and synthetic organic chemistry. After I finished my PhD, I moved over to Health Canada, worked there in the inspectorate branch for health products. And as you may know, Health Canada is the regulator for the medical and now recreational cannabis streams in Canada. Following that, started a consulting company with another Health Canada inspector, CanDelta, where I've got a team of 25 folks. We're active across Canada. We've helped launch over 300 businesses. We've recently moved into the US, specifically the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey. Done a lot of work down south in many of the Bible Belt states, Alabama, Texas, Mississippi, and have also done some work internationally as well. Happy to be here.
Well, absolute pleasure. A bit about what brought me in this industry and kind of we'll lead into this in a second, is as being from Switzerland and always seeing, what is Canada doing, what is the US doing, the trailblazers of the industry, what are the regulatory frameworks, what are the standards, what are the different question marks, and between that realized that it didn't speak a harmonized language. What was done in the US didn't really speak to, at the time, how I saw European medical, at least, and other standards kind of can be harmonized in the back end, and that led then to me kind of starting something from scratch and trying to really bring those different, regulatory frameworks is a big word, but you have standardization and you have different parts that feed into that. Bringing those together and harmonizing certain points there was one of the big things that I put on my cap. And with having, a couple of the esteemed gentlemen and lady over here, Shauna, you've been very outspoken early in this. How can you bring standards? How can you bring regulatory frameworks? What were some of the early challenges you saw over there, and how did you bring the industry into this, and what were your approaches, and what can you share from those early days?
So the early days of regulations, one thing that I noticed, and they're getting better at now, is using very umbrella terms to create regulations, and a lot of times they don't understand everything that falls under that umbrella term, so they tend to over-regulate beyond even what the lawmakers are intending to. And then oftentimes they are regulating with the, with the message of safety, consumer safety. But most of the time, regulators do not have any scientific background at all. So these laws don't actually protect the health and safety of consumers. So a lot of what I've done is to educate them on this is how you write regulations to protect your end consumer.
I think the two gentlemen over there have been also very engaged in the early days. Anything that you remember from back then that we now in Europe, we're at this stage where we can, we can still influence, we can actually, we're part of this process. What can we learn from back then that we can kind of move into?
I think that for a lot of us who are coming from North America here to Germany and learning about the regulatory framework that's coming into play here based on this beautiful leak, the alarm bells, I think, are ringing for us. And I think there are a lot of lessons learned that we've seen from other markets that if Germany doesn't think about implementing very seriously, after Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, or even throughout this process, are going to result in a framework that ultimately will fail. I think there's some very, very important considerations, and there are some major gaps. And some of those gaps, I think, include, number one, for what all good, robust, fair regulation should really include, and that's some means of restorative justice. And that can include elements of social equity. It can include putting those in line who are affected by cannabis prohibition. It must include a means of safe, reliable access for patients. And I haven't seen any means of how Germany at this point intends to transition those from the illicit market or the cannabis movement into this new market.
No applause yet.
Excellent points, Lucas. I think I'd echo, in addition to what Lucas is already said, I think it's very important for us to look back, particularly from a European perspective, at what's happened previously and what is happening before we can go forward. So when you look at medical cannabis in Europe, to your point, Luke, on harmonization, still a lack of harmonization across Europe, right? I mean, harmonization is a pillar of the European Union, and the fact that we don't have a single monograph of flower, which has been talked about for the last 3 years, is ridiculous. You've got, 7, 8 plus European countries that are all selling cannabis flower and have been for the last, over 6, 7 years, where there's no harmonized framework. So if you're a cultivator or a producer that operates anywhere, you've got, arguably 10, 12, up to 20 different frameworks you need to follow. Germany is completely different from Poland, is completely different from Denmark, is completely different from Switzerland. So if you're trying to sell the same flower into those 5 markets, you've got 5 sets of regulatory frameworks to follow, and that never happens in Europe, right? Europe is all about harmonization. So I think the dialogue with regulators is critically important right now to be having, not only at a national level, but also at a European Commission level. And it's incumbent on companies now to start holding regulators' feet to the fire to actually make that happen and make sure there is, at a minimum, there's no explanation why there isn't a European monograph for flower currently. So then you got to start and fix the medical program before you can start to speculate. And what's happening is pure speculation on a recreational program.
Yeah, and I think that those are great points. I mean, there's, just like we saw in the US with this patchwork of regulations, let's just take CBD, for example. You have 50 different states with very different policies, different products that they do allow, don't allow, and we're seeing that same type of, patchwork framework that, now in Europe that has really been imported and creates a whole lot of issues from, THC levels in hemp. At least in the U.S., it's pretty standardized under the federal law, but we now see anywhere from 0.2%. Now member states now moving up to 0.3%, but then we have countries like Switzerland, Czech Republic at 1%. These just creates all kinds of hurdles for the industry. One thing that I do think that is interesting, and even we don't have to go far, as far back as the early days, in North America, is, what we're seeing happen with what we call IHDCs, intoxicating hemp-derived cannabinoids, such as delta-8, HHC. It does seem that at least Europe is kind of learning some of the lessons that from some of the maybe missteps that have been happening in the U.S. with these products, where it is just completely all over the board, from statewide bans to the DEA doesn't know really what the status is. And then, but at least Europe, I will say, has been able to react a bit better. They have some better mechanisms in place to be able to, address these new psychoactive substances. And so, there were a lot of missteps, I think, in the U.S. when it came to that, where they ended up, started having very unintended consequences, like I believe Washington with CBN, where they wanted to kind of ban the semi-synthetic process, but then they realized actually that's how a lot of the CBN on the market is. So, but yeah, at least I think Europe in kind of that aspect has learned a little bit, but still kind of, I think, making some of the same mistakes that were made in the US in particular.
You'd have to try very hard to do worse than what we have in the US. You'd have to try very hard.
I would just piggyback of what Anthony said on CBD, and I think the lack of global regulation or misregulation on CBD is probably one of the worst things that we have in the industry. Because you look at CBD, it's available everywhere. US, it's available. Canada has completely screwed up the regulation of CBD, in my opinion, because we've regulated the same as THC, which makes no sense. And you've got the European Union now that's going down this novel foods pathway, which is great, except that no one has clarity on the novel foods pathway. I've got clients that are wanting to apply for an EFSA application, and EFSA just keeps raising the bar. You need to do human trials, then you do animal trials, then you need to get into human pregnancy trials. And I mean, it's CBD, for crying out loud. Meanwhile, it's available everywhere. So the global lack of regulation on CBD is just benign. And before you can start to regulate THC and look at recreational cannabis, we've got to fix some existing challenges. And you can't make the bar so high that you're going to have an illicit market thrive, or in the case of CBD, just an unregulated market thrive.
Now we've seen CBD, big issues, big different approaches, big, disharmonization, I would like to say. We touched a little bit the medical side, yes. When I started with creating the software, I was like, okay, where do you go? So what I do is kind of trying to harmonize standards through transparency and technology. And it was like the easiest thing to do is EU GMP, because it's the most defined. Of course, it's the hardest to reach, it's the most processes, it's the most different steps and so forth, but at least you have a guidebook. And in all those other parts, there is no guidebook. And I did have the pleasure a little bit the honor, whatever you want to call it, to be involved in some of these working groups in several countries. And a big part there was, and that's my personal experience, and I would like to hear a bit more from your side, was whenever the industry came together and gave kind of a coherent thought through based on other examples, input, be it, looking at the tobacco industry, looking at other industries, looking at best case practices, looking at, standardization in food, health, safety standards and so forth. Whenever the industry came together and really thought through, proposed something, be it through associations, be it through individuals that were a bit, more active in certain parts, I've always had the experience that the ears were very open. Now, we all have a lot of friends in the industry that all they do is complain every day, and this is one of the moments where I, look into the audience and say, if you really want to navigate not just through the regulatory landscape as it comes, if you want to try to pave the way a little bit in your direction, it really helps to come together and gather some thoughts. And I know there's a lot of people on stage here that have been involved in several approaches there. If you could give one or two advices towards the industry at this moment right now in Europe, where we still are at the point where we can have influence. We can still learn from the mistakes that were made. We don't have to go down the same routes. We don't have to try to copy-paste a framework that allowed for 400 tons overproduction or 70% illicit after 10 years and so forth. So any, short advice that you would give to the audience based on the learnings that you had from, the US and Canada, what can we do now here in Europe at this stage where the regulators are very open, the ears are open, we can bring the input. Yes, there was a leaked draft. I can tell you that draft is not what's going to go into action. There is the working groups are very active in there. So any 2 cents, what can we do now to kind of not complain after?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is lobbying, right? I think you've got to be able to work with your politicians, your local MPs, MLAs, MEPs on the European Parliament level. You've got to start engaging with them. I think what has happened in Canada is we've seen that now companies are starting to really get after the government, but really weren't proactively doing as much as perhaps they could have. For example, the dairy industry in Canada is severely regulated. And when they went through their crisis on taxation, I'm not advocating for killing animals, but they actually took cows to the legislature and started shooting them in front of politicians to say, this is what you're actually doing. You're killing our industry. We have no choice because I can't keep these cows around. And so like, you've got to make sure you're really getting in the face of politicians and telling them why regulatory change is important. I think on a European side, you've got to do the same thing. You've got to learn from the mistakes that have been made in places like Canada. And there's many mistakes that have been made. There's certainly some really good things that have been adopted. So you got to be presenting both sides of that coin very early on. Taxation is a huge one. There isn't a lot of conversation happening around taxation, but trust me, once governments start get used to that tax dollars, it's very hard to take that back. And we're seeing that in Canada. So I think that sort of conversations needs to start happening early. Companies that are raising money, and some have raised a lot of money, needs to start engaging regulators and saying, here's a report, just make sure you don't tax it. And really coming and making that public and engaging with politicians on it.
Yeah, I would echo exactly what you said. I mean, I think that, if, legalization is to truly happen, that there has to be an empowerment to have the political courage to get it across the line. And what I mean by that is, we've now seeing it unfold in Germany, where falling back to Plan B, and really have to have some leaders who are willing to go that extra mile to step out there and be leaders and pioneers in what they do. Because what we see, we track about 80 countries globally. And so whenever you see, for a region, someone who really steps out, one jurisdiction, one country, then their neighbors start to look across the border and see that, oh, actually, they're creating a lot of revenue, and they're, maybe our concerns about legalization are not actually unfolding it like we thought. I will say, Luke, you and I were just in Prague about a month ago, and we heard from the anti-drug coordinator there, very bold statements that were being made, and I hope that to see more if things are really going to be moved forward, saying that, we're going with Plan A, and we're not even talking about Plan B, because then politicians are going to latch on to Plan B and try to move forward with that. But the government is messaging at least that they are going to, go full bore ahead with full legalization, and I think that that's the kind of attitude that has to be in place. That you need more than just allies, but you need champions for policy change.
I think an important point to consider also, since Germany is now in the phase where we're sort of at the cusp here of legalization, is leaving room for product innovation and for innovation of companies to come in and really do a successful job and to simulate as much as possible, I think, the kinds of products or the experience that people have known to love about cannabis and from the plant. And I think you do that by leaving room, unfortunately, for a little bit of profitability, because ultimately the goal here is for compliance and enforcement to be active and to be executed properly, for companies to be compliant and produce safe product, that the industry is regulated, but also to defeat the illicit market and protect youth. And to be able to do that, you'll need to be able to have commercial companies involved in this that are somewhat for profit. I mean, from a commercial standpoint, the recommendation I would give to those who are looking to start a business would be to, think globally, but have a very targeted approach in how you set your business. And one of the leading causes of failure in the cannabis industry was what we saw in the first year of operation, where companies would acquire so many assets and so much territory and so many square meters of growing space because they thought this was a competition, this was king of the hill, and that ultimately led to their demise and the uprise of craft cannabis products, which were very low person per plant ratios. And that is now the highest amount of product being sold in retail dispensaries in Canada is from these craft products because they're asset light and they have low licensing fees. So taking a very staggered approach to starting a business in cannabis is ultimately the thing that will drive your success.
The best way to stay compliant with regulations is to be proactive and actually help write the laws that go into regulations. And the only way to do that is to really band together and collaborate with other businesses in this space. Form coalitions, get lobby groups. These lobbyists can get you in the door with these politicians. Find emails, phone numbers of these politicians, hand them out to everyone. Your patients can call and say, I don't like this part of the law. I want this to be written in the law. Like, they can absolutely influence. Remember, your politicians are there for the people. And one lesson that I hope Europe takes, a lesson learned from the US, is that medical, recreational, CBD, THC, we need to work together, not against each other.
Just one more thing, if I might add, actually two more things I'll say. One is you gotta remember that legalization is a process. It's not an event, especially when you're setting up companies, right? You don't do this once and it's done and that's the regulations, right? It is going to be a process. Regulators fully understand this is a new industry to regulate, and it's industry's job to hold them accountable to that, right? So as things develop, as we're developing new cannabinoids, we're getting safety information on vapes, whatever it might be, we've got to start holding regulators' feet to the fire and saying, you know, the process needs to evolve. And so companies can look and say, all right, legalization is done, we've now got a law, and that's it, and now we're going to stick to this framework. It's very much a process.
Talking about a process, I'd like to share a bit what we're doing in Switzerland right now, which I think then also leads into the model projects in Germany and gives us a chance to, we don't want to speculate, but maybe, you know, give our 2 cents on where this could go based on everything we've learned from other industries, from other jurisdictions in other parts of the world. What we've done in Switzerland was we assessed what was done outside. Then we looked at the laws, you know, the international treaties that have been signed, one of them in 1961, a very special one, which a lot of things are based on that. A lot of global trade is based on the Single Convention of 1961. And under that, it clearly states you can either go, you know, natural traditional medicine, or you can go research, and research can be socio-economical and socio-cultural, or as we do in Switzerland. And so what we've set up there, we realized, okay, there is a gap there that we can test how this market goes forward. And instead of saying this has worked there, we do this has worked there, the government came up and really created, I would say, the most open framework out there. In Switzerland, at the moment, you can go, you need to be part with the health ministry, or you supply to the health ministry, you gotta have the municipality, you gotta have a cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, point of sale, study nurse, which is a qualified person, police has to be involved, and a research institute, as I mentioned before, and you can come up and come forward and really share how this could work. And I'll give 2 examples there. Basel is our first one that is happening right now. 372 consumers, not patients, have access to regulated recreational THC cannabis. It is 9 pharmacies that it's being distributed through. Why 9 pharmacies? Because it has a integrated supply chain that already is, you know, fast and easy to kind of work within compliance. The reporting is done under general narcotics law. So that was the approach of Basel, the easy one, the fast one. How can we do that? And it was obviously very fast approved. Zurich went with 2,000 consumers at first. Those are small numbers for you, but we're a small country, so it's quite significant for there compared to the amount of actual users. And there it's 21 points of sale. It can be social clubs, it can be, we have this thing that if you drug points, if you're an addict for heroin, you get methadone, government supported. And normal dispensaries. So what did Switzerland do? Switzerland allowed stakeholder-driven approach to understand all the different needs and challenges that are within this industry. So they didn't say, in Holland it's like this, and in the US it's like this. And I think what is very forward-thinking, what I like about that approach is that everybody has the chance to come up with a thesis and share why it would work like this in their direction. So you have, I would say, the first and only real all-stakeholder approach towards how to then create a legal framework. And I think a year ago, I spoke about this, and everybody said, well, the Swiss, small country, they do what they do. A couple of months ago, Germany went the same way. So we have a lot of opportunities on the table there, and I'd just like to, get some insights from you. What would you? I'm not even going to ask how would you put your perfect model project together, but now you have the chance with the magic wand. How would you set this up for the future?
I want to touch base on Switzerland really quickly. I think it's great that they've started to move forward with the pilot projects, but unfortunately, patients have been left behind. It was only until last year that Switzerland actually started allowing medical cannabis to really meaningfully be sold. It had a legal program for a while now, but certainly not to the level that
20 years.
That's happened, right? So and now access is starting to be available, and certainly the recreational cannabis pilot projects are definitely a model way for Europe to be following, and it's refreshing that Switzerland is actually taking that approach now, because I think it really is a very interesting way to comply with UN treaties. You mentioned UN treaties earlier, and I think that's a very creative, compliant way to come up with it. And I think that's exactly what we did in Canada, right? We basically looked at UN treaties. We know we're technically in violation of UN treaties, but it's a principal non-compliant approach that we decided to take in Canada. We had kids under the age of 18 that were accessing cannabis at a higher rate than any other country in the world. And so we decided to regulate it so we could start to actually have conversations with youth around that. So I think it's important to be making sure we're taking care of some of the foundational stuff. Patients, I think, is one. Lucas brought up the social equity piece. I think that's another really important one, and that can be built into these legislations, and that needs to start happening very early. And it also then sort of enables countries to go to the UN and have a meaningful dialogue to change these treaties, because that's eventually what needs to happen. You're obviously going to have countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia that are vehemently opposed, to cannabis legalization. But at least then you start to get more and more people on your side is when you've had a robust system, when you've factored in social equity, when you factored in, age of access, you factored in a number of conditions within the country. So I think that's quite important.
Data approach, like clinical trials, I think if we were starting from scratch, it would be, let's isolate this compound, these compounds, these cannabinoids, over 130 of them in the cannabis plant, and actually conduct the research, because regulations are based off of public consultation, but also the sort of the political stance of the regulators, the politicians involved in creating these regulations, and public consultation is fueled from the actual data that's available, the scientific data. So having that data in hand, I think would create a set of regulations that is much more fair and robust, and really pays attention to what cannabis can do and what THC is really capable of.
Yeah, and I'm not going to present here a thesis on the model regulatory framework, but I think whenever we're talking about adult use or recreational use, two very important factors. Well, first and foremost, you're going to have to be the illicit market. And two ways that I think are very important, one of which is being done to some extent and one not so much. One being is accessibility. You've got to be able to have a wide range of products that are available, because if they're not going to be provided in the illicit market, then folks will just go straight back to the illicit market. But then also the stigma around consumption. I think that even in the U.S., still, we are seeing some consumption lounges starting to, take place now. But you look at like the German framework that's been leaked is, there's still this stigma around consumption, and you have to bring consumers out of the shadows. Even in the German framework, they're saying, there would be no consumption allowed in the clubs. Home grow, you have to keep it very, your neighbors can't even see the plants.
Hide from children.
Yeah. But there is still the stigma around consumption. And I think as long as that stigma is still around, it's going to be very hard to compete with the illicit market.
The consumption lounges also are there is no smoking clubs anymore. So there is many different aspects that feed into this from different parts from other industry.
We have them in Barcelona, if anyone...
They're all illegal, and I'll shout that out there. Every single club in Barcelona is illegal. It's a gray area that was made for another issue, which was heroin consumption in the 70s and 80s. So that's not a legal model. And yes, you can smoke inside there, and it's nobody is, no repression on them. And I think what really is important is that we gotta find a legal model. I'm not saying now legalize it or whatever this, but we need to find a set of rules and regulation that on one hand side works for the industry and on the other hand side works for the regulator. I haven't heard harm reduction enough on this stage. This is very important in Europe. Anything that happens in opening, anything towards the UN would be very much in the focus of harm reduction and not creating, just a flourishing industry. And in general, yes, there are these different models out there, and they're not being chased or whatever you want to call it. But that lack of actual, the regulatory harmonization behind, which is what would then in the future allow us to kind of work together across the pond and towards Asia. And there's some standardization approaches around that are trying to move into that. And I think one of the big things at the moment, Deepak, we quickly touched it before, is there are bodies in place that regulate narcotics. There's a narcotics board from the UN, and still the industry wants to kind of do their own way in their own direction. So, open question there. Where should we as an industry try to drive this to actually, realistically, based on best case practices from around, move this whole, or navigate through the regulatory landscape to bring this industry further?
I think the UN Treaty one is really interesting, and I think you brought up the INCB particularly, which is the International Narcotics Control Board, and basically their job is to monitor control activities of what would be an illicit or a controlled substance. And despite legalization in Canada, you still have reporting requirements to the INCB because they want to know what's happening. And Canada's done a really bad job, and I think that's where you get into challenges. You've got hundreds of kilos that went missing at the Ontario Cannabis Store, and no one could account for where they went in a fully regulated track and trace, seed to sale, high vaults, dozens of cameras, yet you've had cannabis magically gone missing. I think the INCB is going to start looking at that and going, you've actually done a pretty poor job on regulating that. So I think having compliance systems is very important, and I think it's refreshing even on the Swiss case to hear that Switzerland's actually outsourcing some of those activities, because in Canada what the government did was implement an internal track and trace system where everyone had to report into them, and we know governments do a horrible job managing IT systems generally, and I think that's really been a poor thing that we've seen in Canada. So again, a takeaway that the industry can say is suggest an external entity that everyone can agree to a process through which you'd comply with those reporting obligations, so you aren't on side with INCB, right? And it's going to make your life easier, because I can tell you the CTLS, which is our cannabis tracking licensing system, is a ridiculous system to be using and managing, and it clearly doesn't work. The fact that you've got hundreds of kilos of cannabis disappear magically, something's not working.
On a personal note, I'm very happy that they kept it the way they kept it. I approached them in 2018 and asked them if I can bring this or learn from this system, bring it to Europe. They said, no, this is Canada only. We don't want to deal with outside countries. The underlying basis of it is the GS1 International Standards for Supply Chain Transparency, which is a global non-for-profit. And it gave me the chance to build a product on that. But we have 3 minutes, 40 seconds. Ngayo stood up. When Ngayo stands up, that means something. No, we're not done yet. We're not done yet. Sorry. Any closing statements by all of you? What do you take from the panel and, again, navigating through the regulatory landscape?
I think creating a pathway for research is going to be very important for success, not just in Germany, but in any other market as well. Allowing the partnership between either government or commercial entities and non-profit, not-for-profits, those like universities who are conducting clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and understanding what it is this is capable of, these medical cannabis products and allowing claims to be associated to these products so that we can get that monograph that Deepak was referring to for medicinal cannabis products. I think that's really the path forward.
From my side, I think it'll really be three things. One, don't chase shiny objects. Wait until the regulations actually develop. I think what we are seeing is a lot of what we saw in Canada very early on is what we're seeing in 23, at least in certain European countries, particularly Germany. And slow down, right? We need to understand what the regulations are actually saying. I think we've really put the cart before the horse, developing business plans and figuring out what products we're going to sell. And really, there's a leaked draft that's out there in the ether. So I think you need to walk before you run and really understand what the regulations are going to be. The second I'll say is all politics is local. So, we touched on this a little bit, but I can't re-stress the importance of making change locally and going to your politicians and kind of really working closely with them. And the last thing I'll say is, just the importance of, working collaboratively as an industry, right? Being part of European medical cannabis industry associations or any of the various organizations that exist. I think it's critical for the industry to have a single voice, both at the national and the international level or the European level. And I think, banding together and making sure that you're building the industry collaboratively is a responsibility of the industry.
I would just like to stress, if you are a manufacturer, processor, anything like that, to regulate yourself beyond what the current regulations may be, because current regulations are very fluid. They're going to change. So for example, start with child-safe packaging, even if maybe that's not required in your province or country or state. And then next, I just want to kind of repeat what Deepak said is, collaborate with the industry and collaborate with your regulators. It is much better to be friends with your regulators than enemies with them. Start that conversation early, often collaborate and form a very strong team with other people in the cannabis industry.
And yeah, we talked a lot about the kind of patchwork regulation. I think that the successful companies in this space, have some agility baked into what they do, because there is so much regulatory change and patchwork. So we try to empower our clients doing that through things like daily tracking, not just bill A is going through this, here's its current status, but tracking those discussions, those debates, so that you can narrow in on where there is agreement, where there is some consensus, and what may change in the future, so that companies can be a little more agile, in how they operate and navigating that landscape.
And you don't see this, but we literally on the second are at 000 right now. So I would like to thank my panelists here. I think we did a great job, and now is the time for applause.
Yes. Much applause. Let's hear it again.